Well, thank you all for joining us tonight for a conversation about coming apart with Dr. Charles Murray. And a big thank you to our co-sponsors, Praxis and the Politics Department. We couldn't have put this event on without them. For those who don't know me, my name is Josh George. I'm a junior. I'm part of the AEI Executive Council here. While not an official club at Hillsdale, the AEI Executive Council program works to advance campus dialogue about public policy and introduce students and faculty to the scholarship of the American Enterprise Institute. AEI is a Washington-based, nonpartisan research think tank committed to defending human dignity, expanding human potential, and building a freer and safer world through rigorous public policy scholarship. They also believe in the importance of a robust competition of ideas and aim to promote rigorous discussion and civil discourse on campuses. Before we begin this event, we want to share a few opportunities offered by AEI for the undergraduates in the room. As you came into the room, you should have seen the sign-up sheet for the AEI Student Network. As members, you will receive a bi-weekly newsletter that highlights AEI research and flags internships and job opportunities in Washington, D.C. As subscribers, you will also receive access to exclusive book giveaways and conference calls with AEI scholars. We encourage you all to sign up over there at the table. As you leave, please grab a flyer for the 2019 Summer Honors Program. The AEI Summer Honors Program is a fully funded set of week-long public policy seminars in Washington, D.C. During Summer Honors, promising undergraduates from across the nation and from across the ideological spectrum study some of the most pressing questions in domestic and foreign policy, participate in high-level networking events, visit sites around the Capitol, and hear from leading thinkers and doers in public policy. Now, to introduce tonight's speaker. Charles Murray is the F.A. Hayek Emeritus Chair in Cultural Studies at the American Enterprise Institute. A political scientist, author, and libertarian, he first came to national attention in 1984 with the publication of Losing Ground, which has been credited as the intellectual foundation for the Welfare Reform Act of 1996. His 1994 New York Times bestseller, The Bell Curve, co-authored with the late Richard J. Herrnstein, sparked heated controversy for its analysis of the role of IQ in shaping America's class structure. Dr. Murray's other books include What It Means to Be a Libertarian, Human Accomplishment, In Our Hands, Real Education, and the New York Times bestseller, Coming Apart, the subject of tonight's lecture. His most recent book, By the People, Rebuilding Liberty Without Permission, urges Americans to stem governmental overreach and use America's unique civil society to put government back in its place. Dr. Murray has a PhD in political science from the Massachusetts Institute of Technology and a BA in history from Harvard University. Ladies and gentlemen, please join me in giving a warm welcome to Dr. Charles Murray.
It is a great pleasure to be back at Hillsborough. This is 3, 4, 5 times I've been here, going back to the early 1990s, before the bell curve. I was here right after the bell curve. I was reminded earlier this afternoon. And I gave a lecture on coming apart before the book came out here at Hillsborough. Hillsdale. Oh dear, 76 years old. Well, when I gave the lecture on coming apart, I was in the midst of writing it, and because they wanted to publish it in imprimis, the lecture was written out, which I almost never do, and I looked at it before I came on this trip, and a number of things got changed between the time that I gave the lecture at Hillsdale and the time I got the book written. Tonight I'm going to give a lecture with, by this time, almost 7 years separating the publication of Coming Apart and the situation we're in now. I'm going to leave the situation we're in now as relatively undefined, because this is not going to be a lecture that involves the persona of Donald Trump, but it's going to be one which very much discusses the nature of the change that is going on right of center in American politics. I was thinking about this with this particular audience. Those of you who are undergraduates, let's say you're a 20-year-old, you're born in 1999. Most of you who, if you're going to come to Hillsdale, you probably come from a family that had parents who were politically aware, and you were probably politically aware from a pretty young age. Well, some of your earliest memories were of the Tea Party movement, which was a response to the Obama administration, and it was a classic example of a movement that went back to first principles. It was, in its original incarnation, a full-throated defense of the original constitutional arrangements in this country. And then in 2016, when you were 16, 17 years old, you watched as new, very powerful, populist, and in many respects nationalist themes were introduced into the right. You saw a sort of reading out of a lot of the conservatives in the past as being completely out of touch and out of date and ready for the dustbin of history. And you are going to be in the position of living through and coming to adulthood and maturity at a time when the whole political right in the United States of America is under enormous change. And I have no idea how it's going to turn out. The only thing I'm quite confident of is it will have epochal consequences for the country. What I can do this afternoon is to give you a sense of where all this came from, because that is indeed part of the story that I was telling in 2012 with Coming Apart. I want to describe how it came to be that we have a new upper class and a new lower class. New in the sense that they are different in kind from an upper class or lower class any other time in American history. It's not that we didn't have rich people. Yeah, we had rich people always, but we've got a different kind of upper class now. We've always had poor people, yes. We have a different kind of lower class now, and I'll explain what I mean. Let's start with the new upper class. The new upper class is a classic example of something that was created by essentially positive changes that had a lot of collateral effects that nobody planned or intended or even thought about. The first of these two changes had to do with college and the elites in college and the behavior of elite colleges. I will use my alma mater as the leading example. In fact, it was Harvard who probably started this maybe 3 or 4 or 5 years earlier than a lot of the other elite colleges. What Harvard did during the 1950s was shift from being a school that had a lot of rich kids, some of whom were smart, to a school that had a lot of really, really smart kids, some of whom were rich. Here's an example. The freshman class of Harvard in 1952 had a mean SAT verbal score in the 570s. 570 is a good score. It's well into the upper percentiles of the distribution. It is not stratospheric. By 1960, which was just 8 years later, the average SAT verbal score of incoming Harvard freshmen was in the 690s. For those statisticians in the audience, that's more than a standard deviation change in just 8 years. The average Harvard freshman in 1952 would have been in the bottom 15% of the class in 1960. The same thing happened at Yale and Princeton and Stanford and Duke and the rest of the elite schools. This is a good thing. I was from Newton, Iowa. I would not have thought of applying to Harvard if I had been going to school 20 years earlier. And I did, and I got in. And, well, was it a good experience? It seemed so at the time. I have some second thoughts later, but that's a good thing, that students get a chance to fulfill their ability, but it had collateral consequences. Among other things, it brought all of these very, very smart kids together in one place. But let me go to the other thing that happened, which completes the picture. The other thing that happened during the last half of the 20th century was that brains became a lot more valuable in the marketplace, something that all of you in this audience are going to benefit from. You could just make a lot more money if you were really smart than you could in previous years. The classic example for that is the student, usually male in this case, who has stratospheric mathematical skills and zero social skills. Ever met anybody like that? What could that person do in 1920? To be a good math teacher, you need some social skills. And certainly there weren't very many other jobs for that kind of particular talent. What do you do if you have that same set of math skills, visual spatial skills, and no social skills as of 2019. Well, as you graduate from college, you are juggling between offers from Google and offers from the quantitative hedge funds in New York, both of which are offering you riches beyond your wildest imagination. Because Google and the hedge funds don't care that you have trouble going across the street and buying a loaf of bread and remembering what you have been sent to do. They don't care about that. They don't care that you are socially clueless, because what you can do is something that for them is hugely valuable to their bottom line. Can make them lots and lots of money if you're a super programmer or you're a super mathematician that can create algorithms that suck nickels and dimes billions of times every day out of the stock market. The same thing happened with all the other professions, ones that do require social skills, lawyers. If you were a lawyer in 1950, you were one of the affluent people in town, but you weren't super rich, because the things that lawyers did just didn't bring in that kind of fee. One of the results of the extreme complication that has come into the U.S. economy and into the U.S. legal system is that it has created situations where you are worth a commission of millions of dollars. You are worth over $1,000 an hour if you can do such things as negotiate one of these extremely complicated international mergers, which is very cognitively demanding, or if you can shepherd a regulation through the bizarre Byzantine regulatory system in Washington so that it is tweaked the way that your corporate client needs it tweaked. That could make a difference of $100 million to the bottom line of a big corporation. So you had brains that were worth a lot more money, and you also had people who were very highly talented, intellectually, had high IQs, who were being brought together and trained at elite universities. What did this do? Well, first, it created spatial concentration of people with certain kinds of tastes and preferences. Let me give you an example, and I'll put this in terms of the socioeconomic status of a zip code. I will get to the cultural characteristics of these zip codes in a minute. If you go to Washington, D.C., you will find that almost everybody who is a mover and shaker in Washington, D.C. lives in one of 11 zip codes. They are in Northwest Washington and continuing out in this cone to Maryland and Virginia, McLean, Bethesda, Chevy Chase. Those 11 zip codes, as of 2010, 9 of them were not just in the top percentile of all U.S. zip codes in socioeconomic status, they were in the top half of the top percentile. The other 2 were merely in the top centile. But it doesn't stop there. Surrounding those 11 are other zip codes that are nearly as elite. So that all in all, you've got 1 million people in the Washington, D.C. area living in contiguous zip codes that are all somewhere in the top 5 percentiles of the U.S. population. That creates a bubble. And the same thing happens on a smaller scale in a town like Cambridge, Massachusetts, which has Harvard and MIT, which used to be a lower middle class, working class community with a couple of universities stuck in the middle of it. Now Cambridge, Massachusetts is home to high-tech companies. The housing stock has all been refurbished, and it is filled with the graduates of Harvard and MIT and the other elite universities who are making lots of money in their new jobs and who have formed a culture all their own. What do I mean by that culture? Well, in some respects, I imagine a lot of people in the audience here grew up in that culture, because it is not politically restricted to one side or the other. And in many ways, it's an admirable culture. The problem is that it's not the same culture as is lived by the great majority of Americans. How is it different? You may think back to Parents' Night at your local high school. Those of you who went to a private school can think back to Parents' Night there, and those of you who went to just an ordinary public school can think back to your experience in that there. I'll tell you the difference between the two. because actually I had two kids who went to a super exclusive private school in Washington, D.C. called National Cathedral, and I had two kids who went to school throughout their K-12 years in working class / agricultural small town, rural Maryland. At the super elite private school, when you go to parents' night, the first thing you notice is, even though these might be grade school kids, the mothers are all in their 30s. And if they're high school kids, then the mothers are all in their 40s or maybe even older. The dads are all in their late 30s or 40s, or if the kids are already in high school, who knows how old they are. Because large numbers of them have not gotten married until they were in their 30s. And they had their first children at the age of 35. The woman was 35 or 36. Which creates a certain kind of PTA meeting. It creates a certain kind of an atmosphere in a neighborhood if all the little kids have mothers that age, compared to the Brunswick, Maryland public schools that my kids went to, where at parents' night for the elementary school, all the mothers were in their 20s, just about. And all the guys were early 30s, because they got married at 23, 24, 25, and they had their kids when they were in their 20s. It's a very different basic cultural phenomenon. Another big difference is that at the private school, almost all of the students there have married parents. The elites are very fond of being non-judgmental about family structures, and they will say in speeches that the family has evolved and the old-fashioned notion of the nuclear family of a married couple is out of date. Yeah, they talk a good game. They almost all get married to a person of the opposite sex and have their kids after they are married. In working class America now, about 40% of all kids are born out of wedlock. And that is true of white kids, Latino kids, black kids. There are different rates for different groups, but they're all really high. That's another difference between the two schools. The differences in the culture go way beyond that. The exposure to the popular culture of the country is way different in the new upper class. They do not watch TV 35 hours a week. That's the average number of hours per week that TVs are on in most American homes. They may not watch television at all, or if they do, it's to watch a few movies, maybe Masterpiece Theater, maybe The Sopranos, when once upon a time when The Sopranos were on, but probably not even that. They do not, under any circumstances, watch any of the top 10 rated shows in the United States. They don't go to the top 10 rated movies. If they go to the movies at all, they actually don't go to the movies. They watch the movies on Netflix or on Amazon. And the movies that they do watch are very different from the movies that the rest of the country watches. They take different kinds of vacation. Their leisure times activities are very different. So they don't pack the kids in the car and go to a fishing camp in the Upper Peninsula of Michigan. They go scuba diving in Belize. Or they go to the Galapagos, but they don't go on a great big cruise ship. They go on a small ship with a professor with only 100 people. Their sports are different. So the guys in the new upper class, they are not going to the football game on Saturday or Sunday afternoon. They are not even watching the football game. They may play a lot of sports, but they like tennis or golf, but they're not part of the popular culture of sports that is so common among other American guys. Child rearing is different. Now, in some respects, again, the new upper class is doing the right thing. A member of the new upper class who gets pregnant is meticulous about not coming within shouting distance of a glass of wine or a whiff of smoke, monitoring her weight during pregnancy, having precisely the right nutrition. That's all great. But it's a lot more focused and intense than the prenatal behavior of a lot of other moms, ordinary moms. And after the children are born, you have radically different norms for how the kids spend their time, with helicopter parenting being very common, where the kids' time is programmed intensively. They have all sorts of extracurricular activities. Whereas the rest of America is more likely to raise free-range kids, kids who are allowed to go out and play without being constantly supervised. Okay, is one better than the other? They're certainly different. They produce different kinds of outcomes. They each have their own advantage. My point is simply they are way, way different. And then, of course, there's politics. I'm not going to overemphasize the degree to which the new upper class is on the left, because there are both conservatives and liberals who partake of this new upper class culture, and I know plenty of conservatives who are elitist, but it is a fact that the new upper class tilts pretty heavily toward the left, especially in the coastal cities, very heavily toward the left. Now, this wouldn't be so bad, this cultural separation, this development of a new upper class culture that is way different from mainstream American culture, if it were accompanied by a continued attitude of love of their fellow Americans that would keep us bound together. It has not been. Instead, you have had the new upper class more and more openly express their disdain for and sometimes their contempt of mainstream America. It is a good thing that you cannot go to a dinner party in polite society, meaning the new upper class, and make any kind of an ethnic or racial slur and not get pushback. I'm delighted at that. There is, however, one exception. You can be at an upper class party and use the word redneck, and nobody will push back at you. You can talk about flyover country without fear that anybody else at the party is going to say, that's really condescending. Well, guess what? We people who identify with flyover country, I mentioned I was from Iowa, know what people mean by that, and we don't like it. We know what people mean by redneck, and we don't like it, including we don't like it even if we are not rednecks. One of the things that I was proud of my daughter Anna for, Anna went to, of all places, Middlebury to school. I've subsequently had some less pleasant experiences with Middlebury, but when she was at Middlebury, which is an elite school with lots of elite kids, she was coming after being in Brunswick schools, and she knew a lot of rednecks. She knew kids who self-identified as rednecks, and they weren't her closest friends, but she knew them as people. And when people would use the word redneck at Middlebury, Anna would say to them, you can't use that word. You don't know what you're talking about. I can use that word because I know what I'm talking about. And that was what was needed, to not be a redneck, but to know them as people and to respect them as people. And that doesn't happen. Instead, what happens is epitomized by a friend of mine named Clive Crook, who's a journalist. He has written about this publicly, so I'm not breaking a confidence. He and his wife bought a weekend place in West Virginia along the Shenandoah River. Their home is in Georgetown, which in terms of the new upper class is the belly of the beast. It doesn't get any new upper classier than Georgetown. When he told his neighbors in Georgetown that he'd done this, their reaction was, he says, just stunning. He said they acted as if their neighbors were going to be characters out of Deliverance, for those of you who remember that movie. You know, snaggle-toothed and inbred and stupid and violent. And why would you want to have a place in West Virginia? They didn't hide their contempt. They were very open about it. And in the 2016 campaign, Hillary Clinton let the cat out of the bag with that line about deplorables. It is a line that may have changed the history of the world because it just simply put out there for everybody to hear what a great deal of America had been thinking, and that those thoughts that they were thinking were filled with anger. Enormous anger and resentment at a new upper class that disdains them, a new upper class that does not share their values, a new upper class that in their view is destroying the country. Well, that's what happened in my view in the 2016 campaign. I am on record as thinking that there are lots of problems that Donald Trump creates for the future of the nation. I've not made any secret of them, but when I voiced these on Twitter, I got one response, this was back in the 2016 campaign, that really got my attention. The response to my tweet essentially was, it's not that we think Trump's such a great guy, he's our murder weapon. And I think that's very much a useful way to think of the phenomenon that elected Donald Trump, that there was a great part of the nation that just rose up and rebelled against the overreach of the new upper class. I said this wouldn't be about politics, so I'm going to shift away from that for a minute and try to get back to the reasons why this is so problematic for America, regardless of whether it's a conservative or a liberal who is from the new upper class who's holding a position of power. And that is that you have people running the country and running businesses and writing sitcom scripts and occupying all of the other commanding heights of the culture and the economy and the politics who don't have a clue about much of the rest of America. I tried to get this across in Coming Apart with the bubble quiz, because I had a problem. I had readers who I knew were going to be largely members of the new upper class, and I had to figure out a way to try to get them to come to grips with how isolated they were. So I had a 25-question quiz, and the higher your score, the less of a bubble you were in, the more that you understood the rest of America. It had questions such as, have you lived for at least a year in your life below the poverty line? Now, graduate school does not count. If you have to be real poverty outside of graduate school. I had some questions I just simply had fun with, like, have you or your spouse stocked your fridge with a mass market American beer during the last year? The new upper class despises Budweiser and Coors and the rest of the mass market beers. If it is not brewed by Belgian elves, they will not drink it. Others have you or your spouse gone fishing in the last 5 years? Those were fun, but there were a couple of questions that I think went to the heart of the problem. And one of those was, have you ever walked on a factory floor? And by the way, those of you in the audience, because there are a bunch of you, I bet, who have never walked on a factory floor. Just stop and think about everything you use is just about has been made in a factory. If you don't even know what one looks like and sounds like and smells like and so forth, just think how cut off you are from something that is central to the life of a very big part of the American population. But the even more important question is, have you ever held a job that caused a body part to hurt at the end of the day? I'm not asking of that you work construction and you ache all over. It's enough if you have been behind the counter at a retail store for 8 hours and your feet hurt. But the question is, have you ever been far enough outside your bubble that you've had a job that actually felt like work? Because you know what? A lot of us who are fortunate enough to be in the new upper class, we never sit around at 2 o'clock in the afternoon looking at our watch and saying, when is the day going to end? Because what we're doing is really interesting and fun. For most people, that's not the case. They are looking at their watch at 2 o'clock in the afternoon, and it's not that much fun. And it's not that, we are living in different worlds. And if you've never held that kind of job, and then you become Secretary of Commerce, let's say, how are you going to empathize with the priorities of a long-haul trucker in Tulsa, Oklahoma? Your Department of Commerce is writing regulations that can drastically affect the life of that long-haul trucker, but you have no personal life experience that enables you to understand what's going on. If you're writing sitcom scripts and you don't understand the rest of America, you're going to write sitcom scripts never having it cross your mind that, well, is what I'm doing here really a healthy thing in terms of all the effects it's going to have and so forth. I'm not saying that people who write sitcoms should constantly be keeping that at the front of their minds. I'm saying it would really help if they were sensitive to a lot of the dynamics that are going on in communities around the country that they don't understand. Well, I've been talking about the new upper class all this time, and now I've got to talk about the new lower class, because that's it's a much sadder story. I introduced that discussion of the new lower class with a chapter in Coming Apart called The Founding Virtues. The founders were extremely explicit, all of them, that the Constitution would not work unless it were governing a particular kind of people. Namely, it was governing a people who were capable of self-government in the most primitive sense of that term, the governing of the self. There is no canonical list of what the founders thought were the most important virtues, but there were a few that all of them mentioned, and all of them said pretty much the same things about them. One of these was what they called industry, that we would call industriousness, that it was a central feature of the American people, that they were constantly trying to rise in the world, that they had hopes for a better life for themselves and their children, and they worked endlessly to achieve this under the most brutal kind of work imaginable. The second of the things that all of the founders talked about was morality stated in terms of marriage. Because in the 18th century, you had in Europe what they considered to be a very decadent attitude toward marriage and toward morality. And they saw the married family as the unit which was the backbone of society and was indispensable. It would have never even, the idea that you would have 40% of children being born to unmarried women just would have been inconceivable to them. The third thing that they all talked about was plain American honesty, that you had these duplicitous, Machiavellian, scheming elites in Europe, and Americans could absorb the immigrants that came over here, Thomas Jefferson once wrote, even though they had been corrupted by this atmosphere, because the plain honesty of the American people would counteract that. These virtues, the last one, by the way, is religiosity. The founders were not doctrinaire Christians. You had some who were Unitarians, you had some who attended church regularly, but were pretty vague about the details of their doctrinal beliefs. You had some like Benjamin Franklin, who was openly non-religious, but they all agreed that you had to have a religious people in order to make the American experiment work, because if you didn't, you lost the moral glue that contributed to this kind of self-governance that was absolutely essential. So I go through the discussion of these and point out the founders all said, this Constitution, Adam said it beautifully, if you didn't have that kind of people, that the people would run through the Constitution like the whale goes through a net. Well, what we are watching with the new lower class are a large set of Americans who have fallen away from all four of those founding virtues. Religiosity is way down in the working class. Surprised me when I did this research. I went into the research convinced that it was the pointy-headed intellectuals that were secularizing and religion was alive and well in the working class. I was wrong. Well, I was right about the pointy-headed intellectuals. You take a survey of the Harvard faculty and 90% of them are atheists. But if you're talking about the upper middle class, college educated and so forth, there has been increasing secularization, but it's not as extensive as you might think. You still have about a third of all upper middle class people who still have a strong affiliation with the church or synagogue. And that's a third is not a majority, but it's a big enough number that people who are religious are a really important component of any community. And they're even more important because, as Robert Putnam has taught us in Bowling Alone and in his subsequent books, it's not just that a great deal of social capital in our communities is generated by religion directly, A great deal of the rest of our social capital is generated by religious people who are also more active in secular voluntary associations and social capital building kinds of activities. In the working class, you're down to about 12% that have a strong affiliation with a church. And that's no longer a minority. That's starting to be oddballs who have direct religious affiliation. In terms of work and industry, you had a phenomenon, and this, by the way, all these numbers I'm talking about and all these trends I'm talking about, which I'm drawing from Coming Apart, all of my analyses in Coming Apart are limited to non-Latino whites. And the reason I did that was I wanted to tell my readers, don't try to get out of these problems by saying, oh, well, that's more of a problem in the African-American community, or that's more of a problem in the Latino community. I'm saying the numbers I'm giving you are about the plain vanilla non-Latino whites. Well, you had a phenomenon with non-Latino white males whereby they started dropping out of the labor force even when there were jobs to be had. This was unheard of back in 1960. If you were a guy, you were supposed to be either working or looking for work, and if you were not, you were going to get called a bum. You were going to get called a bum by your parents, by your siblings, by your girlfriend, by everybody. You just didn't do it because the stigma was too great. It started to happen. It started to happen in the 70s, it increased in the 80s. In the 1990s, in the last half of the 1990s, you had a very hot job market, where it was like today, actually, where there are help wanted signs up everywhere. Anybody could get a job if they wanted to. Well, it's not that the number of white males out of the labor force continued to climb, but it didn't go down. It just sort of remained steady and then started going up again in the 2000s. And it now comprises a significant proportion of all white males ages 25 to 54. They are not working and they are not looking for work. What are they doing? Playing video games for the younger ones, and also taking a lot of drugs. This is a sign of dropout. The drop in marriage, the drop in religiosity, the drop in industry, all of these things are signs of people who are no longer participating in American institutions in the ways the founders always said was absolutely necessary if the system was going to work. Add into that, then, the polarization I was just talking about, with the new upper class off in its own little world where it's very satisfied with itself, thank you very much, but isn't all that attached to the rest of the country? You've got a recipe for disaster. Disaster if you're talking about the survival of the American project in a form we will continue to recognize. And let me make that distinction. Nothing that I have said implies that the United States is going to be a lesser economic power, a lesser military power. We will still be an extremely powerful country, maybe even continue to grow in power. We won't be America anymore. We won't be America in the sense of the ideas that animated the founders. We will be just another great power. For those of us who have been very deeply devoted to the American project as a country in which people could live their lives as they see fit, as long as they gave the same right to everyone else, a country in which the government let people do that, ensuring a peaceful setting for that endeavor, but otherwise leaving them alone. For those of us who felt enormous allegiance to that idea, we're looking around at what is happening now and saying, it's gone. And that's where I want you all to be thinking in terms strategically about what's been happening in American politics on the right. Put Donald Trump aside. Donald Trump will be with us no more than 4 years, more years after this term, and maybe not that. But the politics have changed. And there is going to be a new generation that consists of you, who's got to sort this out. And the question that you have to ask yourself, to what extent are you attached to the American idea? To what extent are you attached to America as a place? To what extent do you take the nationalist view to what extent do you take, if, as it were, the American ideological view? William F. Buckley Jr., I have to remember I'm talking to an audience for whom Bill Buckley has not been a living presence. He died too long ago for you to have been aware of him. But William F. Buckley Jr. said it very well. He said, "I am as patriotic as any person in this country. There is not a drop of nationalism in me." And what he meant by that was he deeply loved this country, but he loved it because of what it stood for and the ideal of America. And the question is, how much can we depart from that ideal before we appropriately lose our allegiance to the country? And I put that as a question because it is one of the many severe conundrums that you are facing. I will put it in my own terms. I have enormous sympathy for the people who voted for Donald Trump. Sympathy, and not only sympathy, but I understand exactly why they did, and certainly the reason I did not vote for Hillary Clinton, which is that there are evil forces out there that needed to be opposed. But you can have sympathy for that. You also have to say, but to what extent is my sympathy for that being allied to other positions that are antithetically opposed to my ideals for this country? You've got to work all that through. In the short term, we've got to think about is there any way to get around the polarization that is tearing us apart. And here is my difficulty. I don't have a positive answer to that. If I were to say, you've got to bet the Murray family net worth on what's going to happen, then I would have to put it on the scenario that says the polarization will continue, we will become more divided, our politics will become more bitter, and that this is going to not be resolved in any way where we have a kumbaya moment where we all come together again. We're going to be a very different kind of country, a much meaner country, a country much reduced in its culture. That's my best bet about what will happen. Maybe it's just because I'm getting old. And it's a characteristic of people when they get old, they can't see any way out of problems that a younger generation can't see its way out of. But that's where I'd put my money. What can you do to fight that? David Brooks has a column this morning in the New York Times, which I commend to you. And David is saying exactly what I believe is necessary. It's got to be done on a retail basis. You aren't going to go out and form an organization that brings the country together again. What you can do is in your own community, where you live, you can engage in all kinds of activities that help weave that community together rather than drive it apart. And these are available to you everywhere you live. They're available to you in a Cambridge, Massachusetts, and a Georgetown. They're available to you in Hillsdale. They are available to you all over the country. Not any single one of those activities is going to solve the problem, but insofar as you are engaged, you are basically doing as much as you can do. There has to come along with this, however, some kind of civic great awakening. That's the only way I can put it. Those of you who have studied American history in this regard know that historically we have had at least 3 religious great awakenings, maybe 4. One historian argues there was a 4th in the 1970s. But for sure, there was one in the 1740s, there was one in the 1820s, there was one around 1870 or 80, and they had terrific, profound effects on the society of a non-religious nature. For example, the one in 1820 essentially got the public school movement started. It also cut the alcoholic intake of Americans by about 50%, which was a fairly remarkable achievement. These movements came out of nowhere. even in retrospect, it's hard to see what gave them their impulse. You have a more recent example of a great awakening of a civic kind with the civil rights movement. I am old enough to remember the civil rights movement went from pretty much a standing start in 1954 to the passage of the Civil Rights Act of 1964 in 10 years. And believe me, Congress did not pass the Civil Rights Act of 1964 because they were principled, idealistic people who were voting their conscience. They did it because there had been a sea change in American consciousness, including in white America, of what America had done to black Americans. That's a good thing, but I'm just pointing out that it happened without any governmental help whatsoever. It was all done out of a sense that it had to happen. Well, there might be a sense of we have to stop this out there now. We have people not just like David Brooks, but by President of AEI, Arthur Brooks, by voices on the left saying, wait a minute, we've got to stop thinking of the people who oppose us as evil. 10 minutes ago, I used the word evil to describe what was happening in the 2016 election, and you might have heard me pause because I said, you shouldn't have said that word. That's not, we've got to avoid thinking that the people who are on the other side of the political fence are evil. And lots of people have that strong sense. Lots of people are made very unhappy and uncomfortable by the trolling and the name-calling and the excoriation. So there is some sense out there of this has to stop, this has to change. And America has in the past shown a remarkable ability to come up with resources to do the right thing after, as Winston Churchill once put it, they have tried all the wrong things. I have a story that I will close with in this regard about the underlying urge to knit the country back together. Harvard University has an AEI executive council like the one that you have here at Hillsdale. And I was at a dinner after a lecture that I gave at Harvard with members of the executive council and other students. And I found out during the course of the dinner that the people who were sponsoring the dinner were there in the restaurant. And so I went over to introduce myself. And they were a couple, I would imagine, in their early to mid-40s. He had been a hedge fund guy living in Greenwich, Connecticut, which is where all the hedge fund guys live. It is the epitome of a new upper class suburb. And they had read Coming Apart, and they had decided that Charles Murray is right. And so he said, we sold our house in Greenwich and we moved to this little rural blue-collar town, Connecticut. And my face is probably turning white at this point. These people uprooted their entire lives because they read Coming Apart. You know, I wanted to say, it's only a book. But then they went on to say they loved it. That all the things I had said about the values of living in the midst of your fellow Americans and getting out of the bubble were right. So there is, to some degree, and I think maybe a bigger degree than any of us realize, an impulse out there to say, we got to stop this. All we need to do is unleash it. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. Murray, for that insightful section. Dr. Murray has agreed to take some questions from the audience, so I'll be walking around with a mic. For those who may have some, please raise your hand high for Dr. Murray.
And I'm going to tell them my hearing is shot. So I'm going to have Josiah, right? Come up here, and when at some point I haven't understood a question, he's going to tell me what it was, okay? Oh, do you want to choose people? Or we'll go to the woman in the back by the pillar.
Thank you so much, Dr. Murray. That was really wonderful. Thank you for coming. My question has to do with something that you indicated, that there's a kind of dissonance. One might say hypocrisy, but that would not be quite fair. A dissonance between what the upper class says and what they do, right? They're more religious, their marriages are stable, their parenting is very intentional, and yet we see in the pop culture, which, as you mentioned, the lower class is watching a lot more of, consuming a lot more of, that those things, marriage, religion, perhaps parenting is held up, but at least marriage and religion are not held up as something to be emulated or something that's good for you. So I work for an organization called Canavox, which is mother-founded and led in support of marriage, trying to work to improve the marriage culture. And one of the things we've been talking a lot about is marriage as a social justice issue. And I'm wondering if you would just comment on this dissonance. What responsibility do people in the upper class have to speak the truth about the goods of marriage, especially for children's performance in school, right? Their ability to avoid drugs, all of these things. Don't we have a responsibility? But how would you draw on your experience to talk about that?
I used a phrase in Coming Apart, which is that the new upper class doesn't preach what it practices. And that's exactly the phenomenon you're describing. I guess I'm going to add to the pessimism by pointing out that this is a very bad sign. Toynbee, in his mammoth history, which is not much read anymore, but he has a history of civilizations, and the point he makes is that the growth phase of a civilization is characterized by an elite that is very confident of its own values, and it imposes those values in the rest of society. And what you can tell when a society is in decline, when the elite starts to imitate the lower classes. And I read that and I said, tattoos, four-letter words, and I was thinking of the ways in which the upper class are imitating what used to be considered lower class problems. And I said, oops, that sort of sounds like what Toynbee was talking about. The new upper class is not confident in its own values. It is non-judgmental. Who are we to say that it's better for a child to have the old-fashioned two parents? Yes, we happen to choose this ourselves, but we don't want to urge that on anybody else. It is a new upper class that is AWOL in terms of its responsibility to set the tone for society. And the problem is they think they're being virtuous by doing that, by being non-judgmental. See, you've just driven me back to pessimism again. I tried so hard to end the lecture on a positive note, and now you've just made me miserable again. Let's go to the man right in front of her, the red shirt.
Well, I was going to ask, why do you think the new upper class leans more left than right?
Why does the new upper class lean more left than right? A couple of reasons. One is that the left gives people something that they can say that they're doing to solve problems. So that if you are on the left and you support a liberal social policy, it is a very activist social policy of helping the poor, helping the disadvantaged in a variety of ways. And now those ways may empirically turn out not to do any good, may even turn out to do harm, but at least you can say you're trying hard. If you are on the right, if you're on the principled libertarian / classical liberal right, you are saying something that is uncongenial. You are saying actually the best way to have strong families in which children are well cared for and so forth is not to interfere. It's not to subsidize behaviors that create more problems than they solve in the long term. And you shouldn't do the kinds of things that I argued in Losing Ground created more poverty than it reduced. You don't want to take that attitude. That does not make you feel good about yourself. Now, in my own biased opinion, that's one reason that leans left. Another reason that it leans left is it gives them all sorts of chances to exercise their brilliance in running other people's lives. it takes a lot of hubris to say that you are going to design policies that are good for people, even though the people that they are designed to help may not want those policies. It's an attractive position. If you're on the left, you can have lots of ways in which you can rise to power doing good, and the way you're going to be doing good is because you're so smart, you can figure things out that these other people are too stupid to figure out for themselves. Now, I've been very harsh about my description of why people lean left. There are obviously a lot more idealistic motives for doing it, but a lot of it is hubris. And a conservative, a principled conservative, principled libertarian should above all be humble in their attitude toward what it's within their power to do to run other people's lives. And too many conservatives these days are also forgetting that important principle as far as I'm concerned. Coming over to the center here.
Thank you, Dr. Murray. My question is about Tocqueville, actually. He identifies freedom of association, which he recommended to us, and freedom of the press as the twin aids to maintain the integrity of democracy. Do you believe that there's hope for the media and freedom of the press?
Hope for the media?
Yeah.
Well, there's a huge problem with journalists now, which is that they are coming from the most bubble-like background. I mean, it used to be that journalists were pretty much a bunch of working class stiffs, but in a day when people didn't go to college in nearly the numbers they do now, and so most of them have grown up in working class / middle class neighborhoods. And now journalists are coming out of the elite schools and the elite graduate schools and working for the elite media, and they are as encapsulated in that as anybody else and as isolated from it. So you've got an awful lot of people that need to have some sort of encounter with the real world that gives them a sense of how little they know. But I don't see any signs of that happening. They are coming under an enormous amount of criticism now. And I think that may be one of the good effects of Trump's constant harping on the fake news. Because even though I think he way overstates it, the fact is that all of us who have ever had news stories about us know that they always get something wrong. Sometimes it's innocent, sometimes it doesn't seem so innocent. But if you've had everything that you know, any subject you know the most about that you see a news story on, there are always big mistakes. I don't see that going away. You hope competition will introduce more care in the reporting than in the past, but hasn't seemed to work yet. Sir.
Thank you. These guys are more generous than the girls of the CCAs that get the mic. I appreciate it. Jeff Rogers, sir, thanks for coming. So Coming Apart, I praise you in the book. I enjoy reading it. I'm not finished reading it, but I enjoyed it. But I would be remiss if I didn't take you back to your book in 1994 that you wrote. In particular, I would assume that it was a mistake and probably an oversight that you gave chapter 13 to talk about race and IQ. I think if that book would have been written in 1844, blacks probably would not have had an opportunity to attend Hillsdale College because they would have been judged as inferior and having low IQs. I'm afraid that, as you mentioned in Coming Apart, that that upper culture will be so separated and so hate-filled that someone will pick up your book that you wrote in 1994 and make a case to attack people based on the color of their skin and not on the content of their character. At this college, we don't look at race. If you can do the work, come on board, we say. So I want to give you deference and the benefit of the doubt. I looked at a bunch of your on YouTube and how you spoke about it, and I think you're sincere. But I'd have to use the words the ESPN writer, commentator Chris Carter when he said, "Come on, man! I mean, come on! I mean, you wrote that chapter. Did you guys not think that people are going to weaponize that chapter and use it, and just use it to like take us backwards? I want to go forward. So I'll allow you to comment. Thank you."
Okay, here's a serious question. Have you read the chapter?
Pardon?
Have you read the chapter?
Yes.
Then you know not only the things we say, but the things we italicize, which are to the effect that, as far as we can tell, IQ and race are the sort of equivalent of pornography in the Victorian era. It's something that nobody wants to talk about openly, and everybody is absolutely fascinated by privately. When Dick and I were working on the book, and the subtitle of the book is Intelligence and Class Structure in American Life, and that was the topic of that huge book. When we told people we were working on a book about IQ, the first thing everybody would say to us is, well, what about race and IQ? And the second thing they would say is, well, and what about genes and IQ? Is it genetic? Is it nurture? This is not an issue that Dick Hernstein and I conjured up out of the air. This was a boil that needed to be lanced, and we thought we could do it with that chapter. We wrote that chapter with infinite care, emphasizing we were talking about differences in distributions, that millions of blacks are smarter than millions of whites, that you are talking about one attribute about human beings which is not a measure of their human worth. We talked at length about the fact that people get way too excited about genes versus nature, that the one is not as terrible as people think and the other one isn't as benign as people think. When we finished that chapter and before the book was published, I actually thought, in retrospect it seems very naive, I actually thought that we would be praised for it, that Hernstein and Murray have at last taken on this very difficult topic, and they have done so in a humane, thoughtful, unhysterical way, and they've enabled us for us to deal with this as we should deal with it, as not a big deal. I was wrong about that. There is one thing that I am extremely proud of about that chapter, that if you go to all the denunciations of it, they never, ever directly quote from the book. When I say never, ever, which is a very strong, you're going to have an extremely hard time finding, here is what Hernstein and Murray say, quote, bang, 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 bang. They can't do it. Because if you quote from the bell curve talking about race, and you quote entire sentences, let alone entire paragraphs, you cannot help but tell you, with respect, sir, you cannot help but tell that these guys are doing their damnedest to help us deal with an issue that people haven't wanted to talk about, and doing it in a constructive way. That's all I can say to you.
So why talk about pornography if you liken it to that? You don't want to talk about that. Why don't you just leave it out of there? Just keep moving. I don't understand that.
If we had left it out, I will tell you what would have happened. The book then would have been attacked, because while Hernstein and Murray are making all of these statements about the role of intelligence in creating the class structure, but they never ever talk about the fact that a lot of these relationships of IQ to social outcomes are from scores from blacks from tests that are culturally biased, and therefore their whole analysis falls because they have not talked about the elephant in the corner. We were going to get hit either way we went. We talked about not discussing race between the two of us. Well, and we finally decided, no, it is the elephant in the corner. What we can do is prove that it can be talked about rationally and humanely and calmly. Silly, silly us. Next question. Mm-hmm.
Thank you, Dr. Murray, for your words of wisdom for this college. We're very honored by your presence here. I just wanted to ask about the upper newer class, in particular with the bubbles that they are in. What can people do within that class structure to get out of this bubble? Because you said that it's kind of extreme for people to actually, pick up their livelihoods and go into these more lower class areas. So what can people do in a realistic manner to kind of change and reconcile with the lower classes? Thank you.
Well, I'll tell you what college students can do. If you have come from an upper middle class background, you can not spend your summers being an intern at AEI or Brookings or the Museum of Modern Art. You can go to the Upper Peninsula and get a job at a fishing camp up there. You can go get a job waiting tables at Yosemite. You can do something that will get you out and running into people you wouldn't ordinarily run into. That's something that's available to you. If you are planning on going into graduate school, becoming a professional of some kind, consider taking a few years after you get your undergraduate degree and joining the military. Boy, that'll get you out of that bubble, no kidding, real fast. But you can also do what I did, which is get a one-way airplane ticket to some interesting country that pushes you out of your comfort zone. Stay there for 3 or 4 years, learn the language, don't hang out with the expat community, and get to know that culture deeply, because that'll get you out of the bubble. And I did it with Thailand. I was 6 years in Thailand after undergraduate school. And that will also, by learning to understand a very alien culture really, really well, that translates, that scales up in your ability to deal with a wide variety of problems. So your 20s, in that regard, I think you should look upon as a time when you can do all sorts of things and take all sorts of risks that you will not be able to do when you're older. You will not be able to do them after you're married, after you have a couple of kids. This is your only chance. Use that period of time to get out of your bubble. And when all that is done, and you do have a good job as a lawyer or a physician or something else, and you are making good money, you are not required by law to buy your house in the most exclusive neighborhood of whatever city you're living in. Actually, the most exclusive neighborhoods are oftentimes really boring. I'm not saying you should go live in a slum. I'm saying there are lots of really interesting neighborhoods with a wider variety of people that have really nice houses where you and your family can be quite happy and are outside the bubble. Anybody else? Yes, right here.
Thank you so much for your talk, Dr. Murray. We really appreciate your insights. I just have one question for you. My generation, or at least my experience, is very optimistic about the future in a lot of ways. And we recognize that there are very real problems on the American political scene and the cultural scene. But I was wondering, how would you say is the best way to channel that optimism for effective results in the culture?
Well, what alternatives are you thinking of? Are you thinking in terms of a choice of career? Or are you thinking in a choice of personal life style? Give me a couple of examples of what you are. What do you mean channel? What are you referring to when you want to channel optimism?
I guess I mean, we recognize the problems in America, but we don't believe that those problems are unsolvable or unfixable. And maybe that's just a result of our youth. But we want to affect meaningful change in a positive way. And that includes the political landscape, the cultural landscape, religious freedom, and tolerance, both sides of the question.
Okay. I guess I want to go back to fix your own little corner of the world first, so that resist the temptation to go out and help promote sweeping changes across the country, and focus on what is very local and what you can be engaged in. When I said read David Brooks's column this morning, that's exactly the kind of thing I was talking about. If you are living your own life in a way which breaks through the kinds of isolation and the problems I'm talking about, that in itself is its own reward. And if you can see a way to expand upon that, whether by running for political office or getting involved in an organization, that's great. But start out setting an example for yourself that you can then follow in a wider scale. I've kept you here for a long time, and I'm going to let you go now, but with thanks for having me back. Could I just explain why I said Hillsboro? Because we got a Hillsboro just a few miles away from our house, and it took me a couple of times saying it before I realized you have just really blotted your copybook at this place. But there was an excuse for me doing it. Thank you so much for having me back.